Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Well, folks, welcome back. And today, we're going to get started on some Deuteronomy. Go ahead and spell that 3 times correctly.
I can't spell it one time correctly.
There's no spelling test in cover to cover.
So, Deuteronomy, brand new book. Let's hear, what's this about? What does Deuteronomy mean as a word? I don't actually know.
Deutero means second.
Okay.
Yeah. Nomos is
Law.
So it's a second giving of the law. Leviticus and Numbers and the end of Exodus, lots of laws. It's presented as like a long farewell speech of Moses, and he's giving a second telling of the law. It is a slightly different understanding of the law, unlike Leviticus, where you have lots of like priestly laws and laws that are governing, what's going on in the tabernacle or the temple. Here, it seems to be for a different group of people. This seems to be not for the people in the wilderness. It really seems to be addressed to people who would be in the land,
right,
that they're striving for.
Yeah, it definitely had a different tone to it, I found.
It has a tone. It does. Yes.
Yeah.
Our text thread between the three of us, we're going over that tone and how God seems a little spiteful. In this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it does kind of start off third person, like, and these things happened, and then Moses said, but then, we're 15 chapters in or so, and it's all Moses speaking in I. So it sounds like the whole thing's been written in a different person than the previous ones.
Right.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a sermon or a speech.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Rick, to address that this is really presented as a book of discourses from Moses to the people of Israel. This is, in a lot of ways, people will talk about Deuteronomy as Moses' last will and testament for the people of Israel. You'll actually notice as well, it can be a bit boring because a lot of it is recap. Even when you first start the book in chapter 1, it's just like a recap of like, here's everything that happened. Here's what,
Didn't we do this already?
Yeah, haven't I already done this? And Numbers already recap some stuff. You're really getting a lot of the same stories.
But with anger and guilt.
Yeah.
Lots of it.
So there's some reasons for that.
Yes.
And that's...
Sure.
I have 2 things to say, and we can talk about each one individually. But the first thing, if you ever take like a course on the Old Testament, college, graduate level, seminary, something like that, on the book of Deuteronomy, in the first 5 minutes, the professor is going to throw a large word at you, and that is SuzeraintyTreaty.
Spell that one.
Yeah. I'm not sure I can. Suzerain, Suzerainty.
There we go.
So a suzerain is a king, a despot, a ruler. And what would happen in the ancient world is, for some reason, your town, village, nation would come under the authority of a foreign king, who could come in and wipe you and everyone you know off the map.
Right.
Which is what they do to some people.
Well, we're going to get there. But the suzerain would say how great he was, and here's the things I'm going to give to you, and here's the ways I'm going to protect you. Yeah. Here's the ways I'm going to show you favor. Here's what you're going to get out of this relationship,
and here's what you have to do for me.
And then there's things that you have to do for me.
Right.
And this is in the treaty, every suzerainty treaty, if you do not fulfill your end of the bargain, you will be annihilated.
Right.
This is not you're going to do what you need to do for the for the right reasons. You are going to do it out of survival. And so scholars will say, when they look at the book of Deuteronomy, it is set out exactly as a suzerainty treaty. And so to us, we read it and we go, gosh, that sounds like really harsh and wild. And why is this loving God who, we sing about every Sunday morning sound like a despot?
Really merciless.
To the people back then, they would have gone, oh, this is
right.
God's like a king.
Yep.
It's not the king of that nation who's in charge. It's God who's in charge. And I understand in my relationship with sovereigns that I have responsibility and the sovereign has responsibility.
Right.
And if everyone fulfills their responsibilities, everything's fine. And when people stop fulfilling their responsibilities, everything is going to fall apart.
Right.
And so I think whereas it's uncomfortable for us, I think in the ancient world, there would have been a comfort to it because it would have been normal.
Yeah.
It would have been what people were used to.
Right. And I think you see that repeated throughout the early chapters here. And at least that I can remember, the first moment is in chapter 4. And so at the start of chapter 4, right, it says, "So now, Israel, give heed to the statutes and ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you." And that's really repeated throughout here. Is there is this? It's kind of a quid pro quo. It's okay, Moses, I'm telling the people of Israel, observe these statutes and ordinances that the Lord gave to me, I am giving to you. And the reason that you are going to do this is so that you might inherit this land that is being given to you.
There's the carrot.
There's the carrot, exactly. So, and then in very specific terms, we'll see this a little later, a few chapters later. Let me see if I can find it really quickly as I'm talking here. But this is even couched explicitly in terms of blessings and curses. And Deuteronomy is really famous for this. So this is Deuteronomy 11. Towards the end, Deuteronomy 11, around 26. So if you look there, right, it says, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse." So it, like you said, Rick, it really is this carrot-stick relationship of if you do this, things will go well. If you don't do this, things are going to go poorly.
So, and let me just show you the granularity of the similarities between Deuteronomy and a normal treaty of the ancient world is that suzerainty treaties always included a section of blessings and curses.
Yep.
They always included a section of who are the witnesses to this treaty. I believe it's like in Deuteronomy 30, it talks about heaven and earth are the witnesses.
Right.
And so this isn't just a earthly treaty, it's a celestial one. There is always in a suzerainty treaty instructions for where the treaty physically is meant to be housed, either in the palace or with the king or whatever. And in Deuteronomy 31, it says that this law is going to be placed in the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
So it's not just like general, there's carrot and stick like any suzerainty treaty, but like really detailed bits of a formal treaty are laid out here in Deuteronomy, which is why I think people would have been like, oh, this is really comforting.
Yes.
Because it's something that we're used to.
Right.
Yeah,
and they know it and understand it.
Yeah, and it's important to remember this is a genre. Like we don't really think of treaties as a genre, but in the ancient world, there wasn't a lot of things being written. Treaties were one of those things, one of the most important things, especially if you're an educated scribe like the author of Deuteronomy. You are very familiar with what these treaties are, these granular details of how they work. And so this is being put in that sort of context.
Yeah.
I know you had maybe another point. That was your first point, Rick, about Deuteronomy. So if you want to say the second
9
one.
points. I'm going to go through them.
Giving the law to the listeners here. Yeah. Hear these about Deuteronomy.
And don't forget them, and make sure that you teach your children and your children's
children's
That's
children.
right. For an everlasting generation. Because I have a thought about this that might fit here, but if you want to get to your second point.
We've talked before about how modern scholarship looks at the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and sees 4 general sets of authors. It's called the documentary hypothesis, and we talked about, and we read Leviticus, that the one of the 4 sources is called the priestly source, and that source probably was responsible for most of Leviticus. There's another author that is called the Deuteronomist. Well, which book of the Torah do you think they wrote?
Leviticus, maybe?
So they wrote Deuteronomy, but also Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. So this is the last book of the Torah, but it's the first book of what is called then the Deuteronomistic history. So this...
Spell that one 3 times.
Say it 3 times.
Good luck.
Deuteronomistic history.
Deuteronomistic.
It's a big
and
tough one.
That history begins here. Okay, it begins at the last few steps of the wilderness as we get ready to finally enter into the land. The story then continues on. We have to conquer the land that we're going into. Then we're going to have a period of judges that are going to rule over us whenever there's a crisis that arises. Then we're going to have a monarchy we're going to have kings and queens, and then we're going to have 2 kingdoms with a king and a queen in each of them. And then by the end of 2 Kings, the northern kingdom of Israel will fall, and the southern kingdom of Judah, including Jerusalem, will fall to the Babylonians. And so this long story begins with like hope and promise and ends in utter destruction. We think modern
Sounds like good times.
Yes.
Right.
Look at what we got to look forward to.
Gird your loins for another good story.
More loin girding.
So we think that the Deuteronomist is writing not in the wilderness with Moses, but is writing in Babylon with the crushed survivors of the siege of Jerusalem.
Is this a trauma document like Mark?
It is definitely a trauma document. And as such, it's a theological and spiritual reflection of how did we end up here?
Right.
You know, we were a nation that didn't have our own land, and we were in Egypt, but then we got out of there. But now we're back in the same situation. How did we end up here? And I have to say, like, as a priest, you know, the last 23 years or so, I've had a lot of people step into my office whose lives have utterly fallen apart. And, you know, for whatever reason, someone has died, or someone's gotten a terrible diagnosis, or someone's lost a job, or someone's marriage is falling apart. And the question they almost always ask is, why?
Right.
Why is this happening to me?
Right.
That is what the Deuteronomistic history is asking. Why are we in Babylon? Why did this thing happen to us? And the answer that they come up with is because we were unfaithful.
Yeah.
God had done all of this for us, and we did not follow through with our end of the bargain.
Right.
And so the Deuteronomist is probably living in Babylon, and they're not just reflecting backwards on what went wrong before, just for, you know, the sake of history, but they're also reflecting for, like, what do we need to do so we don't end up here again?
Yep.
And so what's their answer? We need to be a faithful people, and we need to remind ourselves of the faithfulness of God, the things that God has done for us, and the ways that we failed, so that going forward we can be a people that don't fail.
This just feels really sad. I mean, I know that there's like hope in the looking forward to like, okay, so what can we do differently next time? But the like looking back and be like, we were so bad.
Yeah.
Bad us. We suck. Ugh.
Well, and it's not just looking back and saying we're so bad, because it's looking back from the perspective of exile, and it's looking back from the perspective of a traumatic event and trying to come to terms with why it has happened. So yes, you know, it is telling that their response is to then turn to their own actions, which we can then have a theological conversation of, as Christians, is this the way that we understand trauma and events in our lives as the judgment of God? Today. Which that's a big conversation. I do think, and maybe we can get into this later. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Rick's point and the compositional history, but I will just say, as a bit of a teaser, I do think this perspective becomes radically upended within the New Testament, and even within the prophets and within the Old Testament itself. That there is not this kind of quid pro quo. Do this and you're blessed. Do this and you're cursed. If you do wrong, you're going to receive divine judgment. I do think Jesus radically upends that.
Jesus will say, "Rain falls on the just and the unjust alike."
Right.
It's not because you were bad or great that rain came. Rain just came.
Right. Hurricanes happen.
Exactly.
Earthquakes happen, and tsunamis, and these things happen, and
Tis not judgment from God.
Right.
I think this will be fun once we finally, months from now, get to Paul. But I think
keep going back to Paul anyway.
I love Paul.
I'm gonna figure out.
I love
when
Paul.
we hit
Paul loves Deuteronomy, actually, and we can talk about that as well a little bit.
Paul loved Numbers.
Jesus loved Deuteronomy too. Jesus, if you pick up on it, Jesus quotes Deuteronomy to the tempter Satan in the wilderness, right? When Jesus says, "Man lives only by
man does not live by bread alone."
There we go. Yeah, man does not live by bread alone, but by the word of God. If you remember, he's quoting Deuteronomy.
He's also love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength.
The Shema is huge throughout the New Testament, and the Shema is really foundational for Israel. I'm bouncing all over the place here, but
That's not atypical.
No, it's not. It's not, and it's late in the day today. And
Welcome to Cover to Cover.
Yeah, yes. My brain's scrambled. But I wanted to say to nerd out a little bit more about the history and the composition of Deuteronomy and the setting in which it's written. And Rick talking about this Deuteronomistic history that ends with 2 Kings. When we get there, to spoil it a little bit, there's going to be a king, King Josiah.
Yeah.
And King Josiah in 2 Corinthians, oh my gosh, I'm obsessed with Paul. In 2 Kings, it talks about Josiah and his cohort found this scroll in the temple.
They just randomly find a scroll.
Yeah,
They're like, wait a minute.
They're like, what is this?
What is this?
Where did this come from?
And traditionally, we say that was Deuteronomy.
It's the book of Deuteronomy.
It is the book of Deuteronomy. Of course, what modern scholarship believes is that they did not find the book of Deuteronomy. This would have been 7th century BCE, it's around 600-ish. So fall of Northern Kingdom Israel has happened. The fall of Southern Kingdom Judah has not happened yet. That's going to happen in the 500s. And so the idea is this Southern king of Judah, quote unquote, finds this scroll, a.k.a. writes the book of Deuteronomy, the religious scribes at this time. And a part of it is responding to the trauma of the Northern Kingdom falling, but their kingdom has not yet fallen. And so actually a big part of Deuteronomy, to nerd out a little bit, is you'll notice it's all about the centralization of worship and about expelling foreign elements from worship. And so actually, I think part of what the rub is there is they are trying to respond to that in their own day. And so even in some of these first chapters, you'll notice, you probably wouldn't pick it up otherwise, but you'll notice there's this constant refrain somewhere in here. Let me see if I can find it, about not making sacrifices just anywhere willy-nilly. Did you catch this?
Yeah,
there's always like set locations. Like you can eat your food, you can kill your animals and eat them wherever you like, but the sacrifices have to be made at the designated location.
And
when you're offering to God, you're going to do it there.
Yes.
You're going to sit and you're going to eat with God in that location, not somewhere else.
So, and if you remember throughout Genesis and Exodus, people like Abraham and others, they go on these journeys and they actually make sacrifices anywhere, wherever they want.
Yeah.
And it describes that in those books very positively. But here you'll notice, and I found at least one spot, this happens a couple places, but just take, for example, Deuteronomy 12. In 12, let's just start at 3. And if you notice that it's talking about, before 3, really in 2 and 3, you need to go into this land and you need to completely demolish these other cultic practices from other nations. And in verse 4, it says, you shall not worship the Lord your God in such a way. Verse 5, you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes as his habitation to put his name there. You shall go there, bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes. So this is very different than when the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle is traveling. You just do it there. It's moving with you. But what's happening here, and it's not explicitly named because that would mess up the idea that Moses is writing this, is the quote-unquote place you shall choose. It's Jerusalem. But Jerusalem, in the Deuteronomistic history, Jerusalem is not officially chosen as that place until we get to David. And so the authors of this can't write Jerusalem in this moment, but the idea here is when they're having it say, like, you can only do it in this one place God has chosen. It's King Josiah and his cohort's way of being like, we are centralizing worship in Jerusalem. This is the only place you can come to bring your sacrifices and tithes and offerings. And if you notice, there's even stipulations for like, well, if you live too far away, this is what you're going to have to do. And so I just think
you can change it for silver, and then you can go and buy what you need. And
I think just from a totally nerdy perspective, I think that's really fascinating that the origins of this text, that it's trying to deal with these problems in much later centuries than what is actually written here. Of how do we do this now? What do we? And so it's the second law. There's actually a really interesting rub here, I think, about related to tradition and interpretation. this is different than what came before. They're updating it. They're making a new thing. And so these traditions are not static. They evolve. They ebb and they flow.
Well, because they need to evolve. Because
Right.
at one point we're slaves in Egypt, and we need a certain way of doing things. And then we're in the wilderness, and we need a different way of doing things.
Right.
And then we have our own country, and then we have kings, and
Right.
so you have to. And now we have AI.
Yeah.
And so we need updated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like how we live today.
Yep.
I was just thinking about, we've just come out of Numbers, and the end of Numbers is all of this setting up of how things are going to go once they conquer, once they go into like you haven't gone into the land yet. You're still just outside of it.
Yeah.
But, they're divvying up the land and who's going to live where and everything already before they've gone in and defeated, because it's a fait accompli, right?
Right.
Spell that.
Yeah.
I could if I wrote it down. I took French. Anyway, so they've moved from the wilderness where God is traveling with them with the tabernacle to now they're going to be land-based. They're going to have a home, a place that they're going to stay forever. And so coming from Numbers, where each tribe has its location and each tribe has its own place where they're going to do these things. Like, I'm reading it that way. So it's really interesting, because just coming from Numbers, I'm reading it as, there's each tribe has their spot where they're going to do that thing. And so they're going to do that's their location. But you're reading it from like way further out with all this other education about, they're not just talking about those little things, those little locations from Numbers. They're talking about this whole other thing.
Yeah.
But you can get both.
Can we nerd a little more?
Oh,
come on. Just a little
I
bit.
think the listeners will be upset, but come on.
More nerd.
So in chapter 11, you were talking about chapter 12, where it talks about, so we're going to set up this temple. In chapter 11, there's several mentions in the book of Deuteronomy about Mount Gerizim. So chapter 11, verse 29, when Yahweh your God brings you into the country where you're coming to take possession of it, you're to put the blessing on Mount Gerizim. And then chapter 27, verse 11 and 12, Moses ordered the people that day, these are to stand to bless the people on Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim is not in the southern kingdom of Judah. Mount Gerizim is in the northern kingdom of Israel.
Yeah.
So we have, what I've read is some scholars think that there is an older strata of Deuteronomy that perhaps may have been the strata that Josiah found. And then Josiah and his writers reformed it.
Right.
To turn it from just a northern kingdom document into also a southern kingdom document. But they didn't just wipe it all away.
Right.
Like you still
see the remnants.
You still see the remnants of like, we used to worship on Mount Gerizim. But then in 722, that was destroyed by the Assyrians. And so now we need to do something else.
Right.
So back to the Deuteronomists. So do we think that Josiah wrote this, or is Josiah kind of like the Moses, like, quote unquote, Moses wrote it, but it wasn't really Moses?
It certainly isn't Josiah writing it, but it could have been. Josiah is a huge reformer.
Right. He's a really important figure.
The nation was in total free fall, and he brings this entire religious revival to the nation. And so he's really important. He becomes really important in the prophets. We keep coming back to him. And it probably is people in his court that could have been the authors of the Deuteronomistic history.
Right. Okay. Which is just so important. You said his nation was was in free fall mode, right? Like, and I think that, to me, like, to your point, Natalie, about, you can read it as this is following Numbers, and you can read it very much as the narrative it is. But when you know this history, I think it so illuminates those questions you had at the start of the episode of like, man, God just seems really demanding and commanding and like almost spiteful. But then when you think about this southern kingdom in free fall with a northern kingdom that has
already fallen,
been taken over by an empire, has been taken into exile, Josiah and his court are trying to give the people something to reform and revive this nation that is literally collapsing. And so to your point, Rick, of like how comforting this document would have been, if your entire religious, cultural, political life is in free fall and you have something that's like,
we have a solution.
You're jumping at it. You know what I mean?
Grab that with both
you
hands.
are grabbing that with both hands like a man drowning.
They're asking the question, how did we get here? but they're not just throwing their arms in the air and going, oh, well,
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, they're like, we have an answer.
Yes.
And the answer is faithfulness.
Yes.
There's a lot. I kept hearing the refrain about "Do not forget your God, remember your God."
Remembrance is huge in Deuteronomy.
And why do you tell people to do not forget your God? Is it because they've never forgotten God before? Or is it because they're forgetting God over and over again?
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Like,
I'm reminded that, so if you listened to our episode last week, you may have heard our confession that we had to record our Numbers podcast twice. And one of the...
and we asked why,
Why,
oh Lord?
Why, oh Lord, did we lose it the first time? One of the things that I had made a note about, and then we didn't actually get to when we were talking about Numbers the second time around, was about obeying and obedience and what that had to do with like how it was on their heart. How did you phrase that? Do you remember?
Oh, there's a whole thing in Numbers about observing God's commandments.
That's what
and
it
so
was,
over and
observing.
over again, you get observe God's mandate, observe God's commandment. You shall observe, you shall do.
Yeah.
And that in the Hebrew, the ancient rabbis would wrestle with typical observance, like there's a law, observe means to follow, like we're
Right.
going to do it. But it can also mean to hold. And so we're going to hold this law. And so the ancient rabbis will talk about the law of keeping the Sabbath. And so observing the Sabbath means on the seventh day I'm going to take off, right? And I'm not going to do anything. But to hold it means I'm going to hold that command Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Sunday, Monday. Like I'm going to hold it in my heart. It's going to become a part of me, whether I'm doing it or not. And so it's I think it's kind of goes back to we've talked about the circumcision of the heart or the
Right.
circumcision of the mind. It's like that. There seems to be. You could read the Torah, the Pentateuch, as being very surface, like spirituality. You just do this, you don't do this, and you just keep following those laws, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah,
but there's,
A plus B equals C.
right,
Kind
but,
of results.
But there's these places where you can see that there's like a deeper spirituality, and so it's not just the formulaic thing, but it's holding. It's holding these things that God is.
Which was really beautiful. And it just, for some reason, as we were talking about all these, like, remember my commands, it made me think of that. And I don't know if they're using the same language in the writing of Deuteronomy, but it just
Right.
kind of made me think about the way that needing to hold God.
Well, remember,
Remember
right?
and
Right.
hold that in your mind, like, throughout.
Well, I think too, on that point, something we talked about in a previous episode was this actually might have been in the deleted episode, and I don't think
We keep going back to
man,
that.
we're not. Yeah, that's going
We're
to
gonna
haunt us for
remember
a few
little bits of
episodes.
things. You'll get the gems.
I don't think it really
throughout.
made it into the new episode, but we talked about how Numbers and the Pentateuch as a whole uses very relational imagery for God.
Yeah.
God as a parent, Israel as a child. And maybe it's not a paradox, or they do clash in some ways. They complement in some ways. There's also the imagery that you started this episode talking about with SuzeraintyTreaty and God as a king. But I do think it is interesting to this point about observance, of noticing the ways it is rooted at times in the kingly metaphors, but then also at times in the parent metaphors. And so, for example, in Deuteronomy 8:5 says, "Know then in your heart that as a parent disciplines a child, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Therefore keep the commandments of the Lord your God," right? And so
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
very much, I don't think we've actually ever talked about this before, but the translation of the Hebrew word Torah being instruction, and oftentimes it gets translated as, this is where the word law comes from. And law has a very, again, kingly quid pro quo, do this or you're in trouble type of metaphor. But instruction kind of has that
Teaching.
teaching, growth. It's more about wanting to see what's best for you rather than just do this because I said. There's also, I love the line.
Allowing you to screw up.
Allowing you to screw
then-
up. In Deuteronomy 14, right? It just starts, just bam, right off the bat. You are children of the Lord your God. Just as you are children of the Lord your God. And then it goes into a bunch of, you shall not do this, you shall not do that. So, but it's so key to catch that it starts
Yeah.
that way. It's the context of, it literally goes into very practical things. The next verse in chapter 14 is, do not lacerate yourselves or shave your forelocks for the dead. Who knew you needed to know what to do with the forelocks of the dead?
Yeah, I was wondering.
But somehow that is connected to this deeper reality for the author of this book. that you are children of the Lord.
And it's a way to remember.
And it's a way to remember. It's a way to live into that. You have to, you just by nature have to use gendered language here, sonship and daughtership, right? Of, in the same way, you would ask yourself, what does it mean to be, for me, right, a son of my parents? What does it mean to live as that person?
There's this whole thing about what
There we go. Yeah,
what remembrance is, and in our modern context, remembrance can be like a little weak, and it just means to like recall or think back. But if you just think about the word in English, to remember, what's the opposite of remember? Dismember.
Yeah.
And so, right, and so to remember is to bring things back together. It's to make things present that were past. It's why, Christians have waxed poetic about Jesus' words, saying, do this in remembrance of me. And many Christians have said it's not just a recalling, what Jesus did a long time ago, but it's about that happening again and again in our very midst.
Right.
And so remembering the God who brought us out of Egypt, remembering the God who brought us through the wilderness, remembering the God who gave us these commandments. It's not just a thinking back. It's a full recall that this is present to us.
Well, and it requires all of us, right? So if we are all children of God, if we
Yeah.
are all Christ's hands and feet and whatnot, we are all pieces of that body that need to be remembered.
Right. This kind of connects to this topic, but I think one of the things that strikes me about Deuteronomy is, to me, there's a paradox at the heart of this book. I really find it to be a tension between this vision of God that is very legal, disciplinarian, that is, as we've talked about, rooted in you need to do these things in order to live in the land and have it go well for you. And then, to me, this deeper level that images God as unconditionally faithful and loving towards Israel, as not rooted in a tit for tat. And to me, that is the beauty that transcends some of these very legal genre categories of the SuzeraintyTreaty that we've discussed. And so to give one example, in Deuteronomy 10, let's see here, I'll just read 17 and 18.
Oh, right before that, it mentions circumcise your hearts.
Yes. Yeah. And again, I think, to me, that's the indicator that there's a deeper level here. There's something at a more fundamental level, right? Yeah. The line before that in 16 is circumcise the foreskin of your heart and do not be stubborn. And we talked about that from Leviticus. You find that language at the end of Leviticus, that while there is this ritual of circumcision, this legal cultic ritual.
Outward.
Yeah. Outward. There is something already even that needs to happen at an even deeper, more fundamental, I would call it an existential level. But what we find here in the description of God, I think it does go so much deeper than some of the, you'll find in this book a lot of language of God as a jealous God.
Yeah.
And we can maybe talk more about that. I'd be curious to hear your perspectives. But for me, that would be tied to the very suzerainty type stuff. If you don't do this, I'm going to have to destroy you. But then here we get a description of God in 17. The Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And yeah, I mean, it's just so good. And it's and I almost say funny, but it's not funny. That contrasts really radically with these moments where God is like, go into the land of Canaan and destroy every single person, including the women and children. And it is very specific that it needs to include the women and children. So to be very
really
to be clear, this is something in scholarship that's discussed. Harem.
Yeah.
That this is the Hebrew word harem. There's a whole Old Testament studies on this about the idea is complete annihilation. Total annihilation.
Yeah.
It's very hard, and there are not easy answers to these passages. I think you can say things like, historically, this never happened, which is true. Historically, the people of Israel did not enter the land of Canaan and wipe people out. There's no archaeological evidence of that. Even in our own text, there's not evidence of that. Once they go into the land of Canaan, there's conflicting reports about what happens.
They're still there.
They're still there, yeah.
Still people,
and in later narratives, there are still people there.
Yep.
So, clearly they did not do this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a long way of saying, I think in Deuteronomy, we see this conflict between these two strands of of God. And I would say that this deeper one really does image God as unconditionally loving and faithful.
In chapter 4, can I just verses 35, 36, 37?
Yep.
You yourselves have been allowed to see so as to acknowledge that Yahweh is God. There is no other apart from him. From the heavens he let you hear his voice to discipline you. There we have that discipline again. And on the earth he let you see his great fire. You heard his words from the middle of the fire. On account of the fact that he loved your ancestors, he chose their offspring after them. Like, this isn't just a suzerainty, a king who's just dispassionate and just happened to take hold of your village.
Right.
He loves you.
Right.
I was going to say also that at the end of 10 there, that from what you were reading in my translation at the very end, it declares that he's fulfilled the promise to Abraham. He says, your ancestors who went down into Egypt were 70 in all, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in the sky.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so there's the fulfillment of this covenant promise. And you see that, where you read, Rick, was great because it ties into the covenant as well beforehand in chapter 4, verse 31. And it says, and to me, this is, again, this deeper level where even in the midst of this God that is demanding obedience and saying, I'm gonna destroy you if you don't obey. I don't know what to call it other than a paradox, or one might even call it a contradiction. In verse 31, the author writes, because the Lord your God is a merciful God, he will never abandon you nor destroy you. He will not forget the covenant with your ancestors that he swore to them. And then, like you pointed out, Natalie, in 10, there is the acknowledgement that this is rooted in the covenant to Abraham, to give Abraham a family and a nation and a people as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea, and that this is being fulfilled even now here. But that there is this image of a merciful God, and we saw that in Numbers. We saw in Exodus. This is, I think, Exodus 34 is the famous merciful God passage.
I think the thing that I'm struggling so much with, like right now, I mean, I know that the history, we haven't gotten through the whole full development of who God is in here, but what's unsettling is the language is so beautiful for that people, right? And then that God is entirely merciless towards anyone else that's not part of that finite chosen people who follow the rules just so.
Right.
And anybody outside of that, there is no mercy towards. And you just watch it happen throughout history. Like, I think I wrote somewhere, like, the settler colonialism of the whole thing feels so uncomfortable.
And we have this, like, fulfillment of promise to Abraham, but part of the promise to Abraham is that all nations will be blessed through you.
Yeah.
And so, like, that part's not done yet.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, clearly, they're not blessing nations.
Right.
Eventually, they're annihilating.
They're in the midst of they're annihilating people at the moment.
Well, and again, I think this is a really important moment for me to remember that these scriptures are not descended from heaven. They are human communities wrestling with their relationship with God, seeking to understand God, seeking to, I was telling someone just the other day, and we talked about this in the last podcast, for me, one of the most important interpretive verses in Scripture is 1 Corinthians 13:12. For now we see through a glass dimly lit until we see face to face. And for me, that is always a humility and a respect to say, certainty is not the modus operandi of faith. It's not. And when we seek to know God and understand God, we often do it in ways that stumble and falter and are wrong until we realize they're wrong. And that's not to judge Deuteronomy, but it is to say that in all of these texts of Scripture, it is people trying to wrestle with and understand God's revelation to them. And I do think it's okay to say there are things they got wrong. And we do that, I think, through the lens of Jesus. And that's a whole nother conversation on this big topic called hermeneutics. This is just the fancy seminary word for studying Scripture. But, I think we do this through Jesus. We understand who God is in the person of Jesus. We claim every single Sunday that Jesus is the incarnate Son of God, and that this is the revelation of God. This is what the author of Hebrews says, right? Like, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And so I think when we approach these texts, we have to do it very carefully. These texts that talk about annihilation and, these uncomfortable feelings of how have these been used throughout history?
How might they be being used today?
Right.
Even.
Yeah.
I've had so many people say to me through the years, the God of the Old Testament is just a different God than the New Testament. And it's not.
No.
Like, that's not what we say.
No.
And yet...
There's actually a heresy.
It's a heresy. It's exactly right. But this is where that heresy becomes be more comfortable than dealing with the God who we know as the God of love.
Right.
Calling for...
But you know what? This is exactly why I brought up the passage from Deuteronomy 10. And this is exactly why that kind of response is wrongheaded. And I hear it so often. And I'm actually working with high schoolers. You hear it from high schoolers all the time. Because I think that is a very common cultural misperception. God of the Old Testament is an angry, wrathful God. God of the New Testament is God of love. And there's so much we could unpack there. But this is exactly why I brought up the passage from chapter 10, verse 17, where it's saying God is a God of justice, a God who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, who loves the strangers. And to me, the powerful paradox there is you can't love the stranger if you've killed him.
It's true. It's very
And so
hard
to me, I do find it to be a deep paradox that we find this sandwiched in the midst of these texts where apparently God is also saying to kill the stranger.
Right.
And I think to me what that reveals, again, this is why the compositional history of these books are so important to me, is it does reveal this evolving relationship and knowledge of who God is and what God is like and what God wants from us. And I think even here in Deuteronomy, we can use that text to then look at the texts that talk about God commanding the annihilation of Canaan and saying, well, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't line up. And I think that can help us. We talked about in Numbers how Moses wrestles with God, and Moses reminds God of who God is. And Moses says to God, this is not who you are, God. And in fact, what does he quote? He quotes Exodus 34, that you are a God of steadfast love, abounding faithfulness, of mercy. So don't do this thing. I think the way we can understand that is that is what these texts are doing themselves. They're wrestling with God, and there are different voices and different perspectives, and they're trying to get to the bottom of this God thing. And to me, there's power in that. To me, it gives us the encouragement that we are still engaged with this today. Even when we read these texts today, we are still grappling with these questions of who is God? What are God's characteristics?
And you just have to, this doesn't excuse it, but it does help me sleep a little easier to remember that this is written during a really violent time. Right. This wasn't written during, sometimes we think of the Sunday school days.
Right.
Everyone, ran around in their bathrobe and everyone loved each other. No, it was a really violent, horrible time.
Right.
Disease was prevalent. Violence was prevalent. Your town, your village could be annihilated at any time of the night or day. You lived under constant threat. I once had a seminary professor remind us that in the ancient world, there were no street lights. So you stepped out of your home and there was just darkness as far as you could see. And what was behind that next corner? You didn't know.
Right.
And so it shocks us, but it shouldn't surprise us that violent time does produce a text with a lot of violence in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, we emphasize this so much, but another dynamic there that is always going to be emphasized in a Religion 101 course is that politics and religion are completely inseparable in the ancient world. You can't even talk about them as two separate words.
Right.
And that is so radically different than the world we live in. It is so hard for us to conceptualize that. Sometimes it's not so different.
Well, but, we bring our whole selves to anything that we do.
Right.
Whether we like to think that we're dividing ourselves off into different ways, I think that's a modern myth that we actually do that. We don't.
Right.
We bring all of that to things. Yes, it's not legally necessarily part of the way that it is where it may have been then.
Right.
But
and even just in the this might be a $5 word, but the worldview, right? That whether we realize it or not, we all have a way that we view the world, and it's just the presuppositions we have. And in the ancient world, one of those just foundational presuppositions is that, okay, if I'm fighting your people, which to Rick's point, it was a violent world. People were fighting each other a lot. If I'm fighting you and you're fighting me, my people and your people, our gods are in a contest of
Yes.
strength right now.
Right.
If you win, it is because your God is more powerful than my God. If I win, it's because my God is more powerful than your God. And you actually see that in Deuteronomy, where Moses says that this is what God is saying, that like you'll be able to conquer them because I'm more powerful. He even explicitly says, I chose you because you're a weak people. And
Yes.
actually, because you're so weak, it's going to demonstrate how powerful I am when you defeat these people.
Yep.
And so again, I don't mean this to be flippant or that this somehow detracts from the sacredness of these texts, but I think it's okay to say this is an ancient perspective, and it's not one that we have to hold to today. And I think that perspective is one that creates a lot of problems because it creates a very much us and other type of mindset. This is us, this is our God. There's you and there's your God, and us and our God have to defeat you and your God. But again, we already, I'm a broken record on this episode. We see the conflict here already of like, there are images of God that are already beginning to subvert that image, that very tribalistic image of God. But I think we have to admit, we find that tribalistic image here, and it can make us quite queasy.
Yeah.
But it's not the end of the story.
No, there's more Deuteronomy to come.
There's
There
more
is.
Deuteronomy to come.
Well, thank you all for enjoying this part of Deuteronomy with us. All right, and then we'll see you next week for some more Deuteronomy.
On to the second half.
Amen.
Bye. If you are nearby to us here in Wayne, Ash Wednesday's coming up on March the 5th. So if you're local to us here at St. David's in Wayne, please join us for Ash Wednesday worship. You can find the details about that on our website, stdavidschurch.org, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot VanHoy.
and Natalee Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and MoodMode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.